Doubts surrounding the paternity of 2-month-old Lily are warranted.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Salinas has never even met your child and now needs to grow up, stop partying, and step up to be Lily's father. Why do you doubt Lily's your child?
Because we only had sex one time.
Without protection?
Takes one time.
Without protection.
Well, you know that's all it takes as it relates to your doubts.
Well, the night we had sex, I invited her out. She didn't come through. Later that night, I hit her up asking if she wanted to hang out. So she told me to come by, and we talked, we messed around, we had sex. She also told me that she was off and on with this other guy. So, you know, I just took it from there.
Miss Ken, too?
Yes, Your Honor.
So you had a boyfriend, but you slept with Mr. Salinas?
Kind of in the same lifestyle. You know, we both like to party. We were both young. You know, I was in college, and that's kind of what you do. You experiment with that. That kind of faded, and I really didn't, you know, party anymore, so I didn't really hang out with him as much.
This courtroom story unfolds under the firm but empathetic authority of Judge Lauren Lake, where multiple paternity disputes come together to expose how unanswered questions can shape lives for decades. From the very beginning, the court becomes the evidence stage in a divorce-like conflict of emotions, responsibility, and long-delayed accountability. What seems at first like a simple DNA test request quickly evolves into a powerful examination of the relationship between law and justice, and how the concept of justice in jurisprudence is applied when real families are on the line. At the center of the first case is a man who claims he has been emotionally manipulated for nearly 18 years. He tells the court that the child's mother repeatedly shifted her stance, sometimes claiming he was the father, other times insisting he was not. This emotional uncertainty, he explains, became a burden that affected his ability to move forward with his life. The mother, however, presents a completely different narrative. She asserts that he avoided responsibility from the very beginning and only denied paternity because of personal choices and unresolved resentment. Judge Lauren Lake carefully listens, recognizing this as one of many DNA test cheating stories where conflicting memories collide. As testimony continues, it becomes clear that this is not merely about biology. The court hears about missed birthdays, inconsistent involvement, and a young woman who grew up believing one version of the truth while sensing another. Family members had told her who her father was, reinforcing that belief throughout her childhood. When she finally appears before the court as an adult, her presence reframes the entire case. No longer is this just about two adults arguing over the past. It is about a child who carried unanswered questions into adulthood. Judge Lake addresses how damaging uncertainty can be, explaining that adverse inference in Evidence Act principles often arise when one party avoids clarity. She highlights that avoiding a DNA test does not erase doubt. It magnifies it. The courtroom atmosphere reflects a recurring theme often discussed in the Truth Changes Everything podcast and the Game Changing Attorney podcast. Delay does not protect anyone. It only deepens harm. When the DNA results are revealed, the truth confirms biological paternity. The courtroom responds not with celebration alone, but with emotional release. The young woman finally receives confirmation of her identity, while the man acknowledges regret for lost years. Judge Lake emphasizes that this outcome is not about winning or losing, but about restoring truth. She reminds everyone that children deserve certainty, whether through biology or through the people who choose to love and raise them. The court also addresses future responsibilities, including emotional presence and potential child support obligations, reinforcing that truth carries consequences. The second case shifts focus to a much younger child, only months old, and a father who doubts paternity due to a single unplanned encounter. He argues that the circumstances, timing, contraception, and the mother's other relationships create reasonable doubt. The mother counters with medical timelines, doctor confirmations, and a clear account of conception. Judge Lauren Lake breaks down the science and the law, demonstrating how evidence is evaluated rather than assumptions. This case highlights a recurring theme seen in adoption stories, full episodes, and modern family court proceedings. Doubt does not equal denial. The court discusses how social media posts, medical records, and personal testimony intersect in modern paternity cases. Judge Lake stresses that responsibility begins the moment doubt arises, not after certainty is forced by the court. When the DNA results again confirm paternity, the father expresses relief rather than resistance. He acknowledges that fear and immaturity delayed his involvement. Judge Lake uses this moment to underline a broader lesson, often echoed in Celebrate Recovery testimonies. Accountability is the first step toward meaningful change. The court orders clarity on future involvement and reinforces the importance of financial and emotional support, referencing how Supreme Court child support principles exist to protect children, not punish parents. The final case brings multiple women into the courtroom against a single man, creating a complex web of overlapping relationships, mistrust, and repeated denial. Here, Judge Lake confronts a pattern rather than an isolated incident. The defendant admits to unstable relationships and poor decisions, while the mothers describe years of uncertainty, emotional strain, and inconsistent support. A grandmother's testimony adds another layer, acknowledging generational patterns and expressing concern that history is repeating itself. This portion of the hearing directly reflects discussions common in the Divorce Course podcast, where repeated avoidance of responsibility leads to long-term harm, not only for children but for entire families. Judge Lake speaks candidly about the legal and moral obligations of parenthood, emphasizing that the law exists to interrupt cycles of neglect. DNA results confirm paternity for multiple children, removing any remaining ambiguity. Judge Lake's response is firm and instructive. She explains that the court's role is not only to determine biological facts, but also to uphold the relationship between law and justice. The truth, once revealed, requires action. Promises without follow-through are no longer acceptable. The court makes it clear that continued denial will no longer shield anyone from responsibility. Across all cases, a consistent message emerges. DNA tests may bring fear, regret, or unexpected outcomes, but they ultimately restore balance. These proceedings demonstrate why people regret taking a DNA test only when they fear accountability, not because the test itself is unjust. In every instance, the truth becomes the foundation for healing, structure, and lawful responsibility. Judge Lauren Lake closes the courtroom with a reminder that children should never have to return years later seeking answers that could have been provided early. Whether discussing child support, emotional absence, or identity, the court reinforces that justice is not delayed without consequence. These cases stand as a clear example of how modern courts apply the concept of justice in jurisprudence, by centering the child, demanding truth, and ensuring accountability through law. As the courtroom proceedings continue, Judge Lauren Lake carefully reframes the conversation away from accusation and toward accountability. What becomes increasingly clear is that these cases are not isolated incidents, but reflections of a broader pattern seen repeatedly in family courts, where hesitation, denial, and emotional avoidance delay justice for children who deserve clarity. This is precisely why DNA test people regret taking situations are discussed so often in legal forums, not because the science is flawed, but because the truth forces responsibility. In the courtroom, Judge Lake explains how the law does not operate on feelings alone. Evidence, timelines, medical facts, and sworn testimony guide the court's decisions. This is the true evidence stage in divorce case, like disputes, even when the parents were never legally married. Emotions may run high, but the court's responsibility is to separate narrative from fact. This distinction reflects ongoing discussions in the relationship between law and justice, where fairness depends on evidence, not persuasion. One of the strongest moments arises when the court examines how long-term uncertainty affects a child's identity. Judge Lake emphasizes that paternity is not just a legal label. It shapes how a child understands themselves, their place in a family, and their emotional security. In several of these cases, the children involved grew up hearing conflicting stories, sometimes being accepted and other times pushed away. The court acknowledges that this inconsistency creates emotional harm that cannot be undone by apologies alone. Judge Lake references how courts often face resistance when ordering DNA testing. Some parents fear the outcome, others fear financial obligations, and some simply fear exposure of past choices. Yet the court makes it clear that avoiding the test can trigger an adverse inference in Evidence Act situations, where refusal itself becomes part of the evidence. In simple terms, silence or delay can speak just as loudly as words. As proceedings move forward, the courtroom hears how child support is often misunderstood. Judge Lake clarifies that Supreme Court child support principles exist to protect the child's welfare, not to punish parents for past behavior. Support is framed not as a penalty, but as a responsibility that flows naturally from parenthood. This explanation aligns closely with discussions from the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal experts stress that accountability is foundational to justice. Another powerful aspect of the hearings is the acknowledgement of regret. Several defendants openly admit that fear and immaturity influenced their earlier decisions. Judge Lake does not dismiss these admissions, but she also does not allow regret to replace responsibility. She reminds the court that while personal growth is important, it must be paired with action. This mirrors themes often explored in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acknowledgement of wrongdoing is only the first step toward meaningful change. The court also examines how family members sometimes contribute to confusion rather than clarity. In more than one case, relatives stepped in to fill gaps left by absent parents, sometimes unintentionally reinforcing false assumptions. Judge Lake addresses this carefully, acknowledging the love and support provided by extended family, while emphasizing that honesty must remain central. Children, she explains, can handle difficult truths better than prolonged uncertainty. As additional DNA results are presented, a pattern becomes undeniable. In each instance, the science delivers clear answers, cutting through years of speculation and emotional conflict. Judge Lake underscores that DNA testing does not create problems, it resolves them. This point resonates with broader conversations seen in Truth Changes Everything podcast, where real-life cases demonstrate how clarity, though painful at first, ultimately restores balance. The courtroom atmosphere shifts from confrontation to reflection. Parents begin to understand that their private decisions have public consequences when they affect a child's life. Judge Lake speaks directly about the concept of justice in jurisprudence, explaining that justice is not about assigning blame for the past, but about setting a lawful and ethical path forward. The court's rulings are designed not just to determine paternity, but to establish stability. Adoption Stories' full episodes are briefly referenced as Judge Lake explains that biology is only one form of parenthood. She acknowledges that many children are raised by individuals who are not their biological parents and thrive because of love and consistency. However, she stresses that knowing one's biological origins remains a fundamental right. The court does not diminish the role of non-biological caregivers, but it insists on truth as the foundation for every family structure. As the hearings near conclusion, Judge Lake addresses the emotional toll these cases take on young adults who return to court seeking closure. She explains that delayed truth often resurfaces later in life, during major milestones such as graduations, marriages, or the birth of a child. These moments, she says, reopen unresolved questions and can cause renewed emotional pain. This is why the court prioritizes resolution now rather than later. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Lake maintains a balance of empathy and firmness. She listens, acknowledges pain, and validates emotion, but consistently brings the focus back to responsibility. The law, she reminds everyone, cannot rewrite the past, but it can shape the future. This principle reflects the core mission of family courts and aligns with teachings often discussed in the Divorce Course podcast. In closing remarks for this phase of the hearings, Judge Lake reiterates that truth is not optional in matters of parenthood. Whether the outcome confirms or denies biological ties, the child deserves honesty. She emphasizes that DNA testing, child support orders, and parental responsibility are tools of justice, not weapons of punishment. These cases collectively demonstrate why courts insist on clarity. When people regret taking a DNA test, it is often because it removes the comfort of uncertainty. But as the court makes unmistakably clear, uncertainty benefits no one, least of all the child. Truth may be difficult, but it is the only path toward lawful resolution, emotional healing, and genuine accountability. The courtroom adjourns with a clear message. Justice is served not when stories are believed, but when truth is established and responsibility is accepted. As the final phase of these courtroom proceedings unfolds, Judge Lauren Lake brings every unresolved thread back to a single, unavoidable truth. Parenthood cannot exist in uncertainty. Across all cases presented, the court has witnessed years, sometimes decades, of confusion, denial, and emotional avoidance. What stands out most is not the conflict between adults, but the lasting impact of that conflict on children who were left waiting for answers. This is why these cases reflect the reality often discussed when people say that DNA test people regret taking. Because once the truth is revealed, there is no place left to hide. Judge Lake explains that family court is not designed to punish personal mistakes. Instead, it exists to restore balance where imbalance has persisted for too long. Each case presented before her demonstrates how unresolved paternity questions quietly shape lives. Children grow up unsure of who they are, parents move forward without closure, and families fracture under the weight of unanswered questions. The courtroom, therefore, becomes the final evidence stage in divorce case, style disputes, even when marriage was never involved. One of the most critical lessons emphasized by the court is that truth delayed is truth magnified. Years of avoidance do not weaken responsibility, they strengthen it. Judge Lake directly addresses how refusal or delay in taking a DNA test can lead to adverse inference in Evidence Act reasoning. When a parent avoids clarity, the court is forced to consider that avoidance itself as meaningful behavior. Silence, Judge Lake notes, often speaks louder than denial. Throughout the hearings, multiple defendants express regret for missed birthdays, missed graduations, missed chances to build relationships. Judge Lake acknowledges this regret but draws a clear legal boundary. Regret does not absolve responsibility. In fact, the court stresses that accountability begins at the moment doubt arises, not when certainty is forced through a court order. This perspective aligns closely with discussions featured in the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where legal accountability is framed as an active duty rather than a reactive one. The court also addresses how financial responsibility is often misunderstood. Judge Lake explains that Supreme Court child support principles exist to protect the child's right to stability, not to punish parents for their past. Child support is not a moral judgment. It is a legal safeguard. The court makes it clear that support obligations flow from parenthood itself, regardless of how or when that parenthood is acknowledged. Another recurring theme is the emotional cost of inconsistency. Several children involved in these cases grew up believing one version of their identity, only to have it questioned or withdrawn later. Judge Lake describes this emotional instability as one of the most damaging consequences of unresolved paternity. In her view, the relationship between law and justice becomes most visible when the court prioritizes a child's emotional well-being alongside legal clarity. Judge Lake also confronts the reality that extended families sometimes unintentionally reinforce false narratives. Grandparents, relatives, and even close family friends may step in to fill emotional gaps, offering love and support while unknowingly contributing to confusion. The court recognizes these efforts with compassion, but it also insists that love must coexist with honesty. This balance is frequently explored in adoption stories' full episodes, where children thrive best when truth is present, even when family structures are complex. As the final DNA results are confirmed, the courtroom atmosphere shifts from tension to reflection. The science removes speculation entirely. Judge Lake reinforces that DNA testing does not create conflict, it reveals it. What follows is not chaos but clarity. This principle echoes the core message of the Truth Changes Everything podcast, where real-life cases repeatedly show that truth, though painful at first, ultimately restores order. Judge Lake spends time addressing the defendants directly, reminding them that being a parent is not a passive role. Parenthood demands presence, consistency, and accountability. The court emphasizes that legal confirmation of paternity is not the end of responsibility, it is the beginning. This message mirrors the insights often shared in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where acknowledgement of wrongdoing must be followed by sustained change. The court also discusses how these cases reflect broader societal patterns. Many defendants admit that immaturity, fear, or lifestyle choices influenced their earlier decisions. Judge Lake does not dismiss these explanations, but she makes it clear that adulthood requires growth. The law cannot accommodate perpetual avoidance. This perspective reinforces the concept of justice in jurisprudence, where fairness is achieved not by excusing behavior, but by correcting its consequences. Judge Lake also addresses the emotional strength of the children involved. Several young adults appear in court seeking closure rather than confrontation. Their testimonies highlight how unanswered questions resurface at critical life moments: graduations, marriages, parenthood. The court recognizes that these milestones often trigger a renewed need for identity and belonging. This is why delaying truth is never neutral. It simply postpones the moment of reckoning. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Lake maintains her signature balance of firmness and empathy. She listens carefully, asks direct questions, and ensures that every voice is heard. Yet she never allows emotion to overshadow evidence. This disciplined approach underscores why family court decisions carry such lasting weight. The court does not deal in assumptions, it deals in facts. In addressing the broader implications, Judge Lake explains that DNA testing is not about proving someone wrong. It is about proving something right. Whether the results confirm or deny biological ties, the outcome gives everyone involved a foundation to move forward. This clarity is essential not only for emotional healing, but for lawful resolution. The court emphasizes that unresolved paternity questions undermine trust in both family relationships and legal systems. Judge Lake also revisits the issue of denial and how it affects future generations. When children grow up watching adults avoid responsibility, they internalize those patterns. The court stresses that breaking this cycle requires courage, the courage to face truth and accept its consequences. This lesson aligns with broader discussions in the Divorce Course podcast, where long-term family stability is linked directly to early accountability. As the final rulings are reinforced, Judge Lake makes it clear that the court's involvement does not end with a DNA result. Orders related to child support, visitation, and parental responsibility are designed to create structure moving forward. The law, she reminds everyone, exists not to revisit the past endlessly, but to protect the future. In her closing remarks, Judge Lake emphasizes that justice is not about perfect choices, it is about honest ones. The courtroom is not a place of condemnation, but of resolution. When people regret taking a DNA test, it is often because truth demands action. But without that truth, families remain trapped in cycles of doubt and resentment. These cases collectively illustrate why the court insists on clarity. Children deserve to know where they come from. Parents must face the realities of their choices, and the law must uphold truth as the foundation of justice. In the end, the courtroom does not ask for perfection, it asks for responsibility. With that, Judge Lauren Lake adjourns the court, leaving behind a final reminder. Truth may be difficult, but it is the only path that leads to justice, stability, and healing.